All right, welcome to everyone to tonight's Meet a Deaf Professional. Super honored to showcase Megan Majocha. Welcome. Thanks for taking your time to come. Sorry, my cat. I wasn't expecting that. Maybe your cat's going to show up too,
Yeah,
Megan.
maybe.
Okay, welcome. Welcome to tonight. It's to take the time to come and share with us and the families that participate in our program for deaf community members and professionals that are in, you are in the breast cancer awareness research. So before we go ahead and learn about what you do, I would like to know more about who you are. What is your background? Where are you from? And just a little bit about your life. So if we could start with that, just tell me about yourself, about your family, where you went to school, were you born deaf? Did you become deaf later? What happened?
Hi, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me here. I'm a third generation of a deaf family. My parents are deaf. On my dad's side, so my grandparents on my dad's side, they're also deaf, but I'm the only deaf child of my family. I have two siblings. They're both codas. They're both hearing. And I was born deaf as a third generation deaf person. And then I went to Western Pennsylvania School for the Deaf, WPSD, in Pittsburgh, my entire primary school career. And then in about middle school, 7th grade, my parents then thought I needed to experience both the hearing and deaf world. So they asked me if I was interested in going to a mainstream public school. And I was really excited. I wanted to, but only for one class. So I went there for the one class, just started with one. So went to public school, had an interpreter for the first time. Yep. And just really fell in love with that environment. So the next year I took 2 classes, and then I became a half day at the public school, hearing school, and then half day at the deaf school for the deaf. I interacted with my classmates, the culture, the deaf community at my school for the deaf, and then at the public school, they taught me how to work with interpreters. And I really benefited me, especially for where I am today. And I graduated in 2015 and then went to Gallaudet University and decided to major in biology. When I graduated from Gallaudet, I worked at the NIH, the National Institute of Health, in their post-baccalaureate fellowship for 1 year just to see and get some lab experience. And then I decided to apply to graduate school. So now I'm in I'm a 4th year PhD student at the NIH and they partner with Georgetown University in cancer biology. So that's my story.
That's wonderful. So now that we know a little bit about you, I know that this question may come up later. So let's go ahead and address it now. Do you use any hearing assisted technology or anything that you use?
That's a good question. I don't use any. Back in middle school, I tried to use a hearing aid, but it didn't really work for me. So yeah, it just didn't work. I didn't like it. I felt like it was just noisy around me. I just decided to continue with nothing.
Well, I knew that question was going to come up, so I thought, well, let's address it on the front end. So you've told us a little bit about yourself and your background. If we could transition now more to your experience working with STEM. And STEM, for those that don't know, means science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. A wide range of different disciplines within one field. So what made you interested in that particular field? Why STEM? Why not something else that's out there?
That's a good question. Growing up, I was always very curious. I asked my dad why for everything. And he would get sick of me. He'd have to explain the reason why for everything that I encountered. So I always had that curiosity just deep rooted in me. And then in middle school and high school, I started to notice that I was taking a lot more science course credits than actually necessary to graduate. And I just became fascinated with earth science and forensic science, anatomy, just all different types of sciences. So I just knew that in college I needed something related to science, no matter what it was.
When you went into college, you mentioned majoring in biology.
Yeah.
Did you already know that that's what you wanted to do, or something related to cancer? Or, I mean,
No,
what led you towards the cancer research area?
I did not know until my last semester of college at Gallaudet. So I entered Gallaudet and thought that I wanted to become a gynecologist. I wanted to go to med school. I knew that. I wanted to study for the MCAT. I was ready. I had it all planned out, but I realized after a few internships that I had done, if I went to med school, was that really what I wanted to do and work with those patients? Like, is that really what I wanted to do? So I started to doubt myself a little bit. And the internship that I had, it really helped me realize that I wanted to do something research related. But still, what any research topic I could do, that's such a broad question. And in biology, again, it could be anything. So really wanted to take my time to do a bunch of research experience, and then really fell in love with genetics and research with genetics. And it was close to the time I was going to graduate Gallaudet. I didn't know what I was going to do next. And I talked with my advisor at Gallaudet, and they recommended me that there was a year-long internship opportunity at the NIH, and that there was already some deaf people working there. So I got in contact with them, got that position. And hold on, let me go back. So the genetics research internship was more related with cancer genetics. So I benefited with that internship. And then from there, the rest is history.
So I know genetics is a hot topic with deaf people. And some deaf people feel, genetics, I mean, I don't want to be I don't want somebody to be researching me. So for clarification purposes, what kind of genetics are you researching? You're researching cancer specifically.
Yes.
Okay, so you decide you want to get involved in research related specifically with cancer, and all that is involved with that. And you figure out, trying to figure out how to improve the experience for people that have cancer. So I'm sure that you probably face some obstacles as a deaf person, or you know what, maybe there weren't any barriers or obstacles. But if there weren't any, if there were some, what did they look like?
So more related with my work experience in the lab, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I have a couple stories. At the NIH, I joined for that 1-year internship, and they already had one deaf lab technician that worked there. They had worked there for probably 22 years. So they already had a scientific team of interpreters. They had developed specific signs, and they had interpreters that worked on Monday, Tuesday for many years. It was like that. So I was very lucky to join a team that already had that type of access. The interpreters were there in the lab full time, 9 to 5, every single day. That was very nice. And then in my lab, there were a few hearing people that were learning sign language as well. So that was 4 years ago. And now half of them are fluent in ASL. So that was incredible. But one barrier that I had was at Georgetown. So I couldn't bring an interpreter from the NIH to Georgetown because there's
Right,
definition there. They needed to be assigned there. So I had to look for my own interpreter. But I had to question, did they know science? Science is such a different language in and of itself. And then ASL and science, that's even worse. So it was a little tough to get there, but I found my team. I found my interpreter. They picked up my signs, my terms that I'd regularly use, and now I still work with those interpreters. The cost related to interpreters to go to conferences, they weren't willing to send my interpreter with me to conferences. They said that the specific conference I was going to had to pay for the interpreter. The interpreters at the conference I was going to, though, didn't know my research, the projects that I had been working on. So it made the interpreting process very difficult. So my accessibility was lessened. If I didn't understand something, or the interpreter didn't know something, or didn't understand something I was doing, those were great barriers. But I learned how to advocate for myself through that.
So related to advocacy, one of the questions that I had planned to ask was, how did you learn how to advocate for yourself? And what does that look like?
Sure. So one incredible learning experience that I had was back during my internship at my freshman year at Gallaudet. It was the summer internship. So I did 8 weeks of research, and then all of the interns had to give their final presentation to the entire department. It was like a wrap up of the summer internship. So I was maybe a week before I was supposed to give my presentation. I talked to my supervisor and told them I wanted to practice my Sorry, let me go back again. That internship did not provide interpreters. It was only an hour per week that I had an interpreter. That was all. So I really had to take that time, any questions I had to condense it into 1 hour for the entire week. So that was tough. So it came time to the presentation. My supervisor wasn't available at the same time the interpreters were going to be there. So he made me give the presentation in front of him without my interpreter. So I was signing to him, and everything went over his head, everything I said. And he watched me. I had no feedback, nothing. And it made me realize that access, it's incredibly important. And after that, it just stuck with me. An interpreter, I had to fight to get that interpreter. I needed that accessibility in order to do well. So that one experience really helped me learn to advocate for myself. And now I know how to be clear and know that I can get what I need from that.
Okay, I'm surprised that you actually had that experience because, with the ADA law and tech requirements, the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, it requires that places provide interpreters. It requires places to provide access. So with that in mind, how does that even happen? But unfortunately, it does more often than not.
Yeah, looking back, I was young. I was a freshman in college. I was new to the field. So growing up in the mainstream school environment, I had the same interpreter for 6 years. I didn't have to fight with anyone. I was lucky to have full access in the beginning. So now I came to this situation. I didn't know how to fight for what I needed. I didn't know what language to even use to ask for that. So I wasn't sure how to face that situation at first. But now I've learned so much from. I learned it the hard way.
But I'm glad you're here to share that story with us here with the families and the audience, because so many of our families right now have children from birth to 5, and maybe, or they may probably go to a public school where they will have an interpreter. And that doesn't mean that experience is going to be the exact same thing after that child graduates.
Right.
So after graduation, it's a whole different ballgame.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, thanks for sharing that, because our families need to be aware and have it in the back of their mind to teach advocacy early on to their children. Okay, going back to your experience in breast cancer research as a deaf person, obviously, being deaf, does that help your work in the breast cancer research area? Does it give you any benefits or deaf gain?
I haven't really thought about that. Hmm, gain. So you mean like opportunities?
Yeah, exactly. Anything.
Yeah, I think many workplaces, they must meet the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. They have standards to meet. They must make sure that they have diversity in your workplace, things like that. So being deaf is one of those minorities that they have to include. So we meet their diversity needs. But what I really realized is sometimes when someone meets a deaf person, they think, oh, I've met my diversity need. But you do have to work extra hard to prove to that workplace that I'm more than just a deaf person that meets your diversity quota. I'm able to be just as great as everyone else that works at your place.
I'm glad you brought that point up because I'm sure. Didn't you say you went, was it 4 years? 4 years?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm sure that compared to your first year and now your fourth year, people probably realize that you are different than you were when you first joined. They didn't think much of it, but now I'm sure that they are aware of so many things, that you have a lot of information. You're a great advocate. And then, other people, I'm sorry, the interpreter missed the last sentence. So did anyone, kind of, not take you seriously as a deaf person? Did you have that type of experience?
Yeah, I do have one example of that. I still feel this little bit of rage from the experience. So I was working in the lab and I had an appointment with one of the core people that was doing a specific experiment. So I went up with my interpreter and the core, like a coordinator was sitting. So I came in, told them I was here, have an appointment, and they looked at the interpreter the entire time. I'm used to that. It was fine, but they constantly referred to me as her, she. They were referring to me not directly. Can you tell her? Can you tell Megan? They weren't talking to me directly. And again, I'm used to that, but I did have to remind them, say, please talk to me directly. The interpreter is just translating what I'm saying. The coordinator understood, but there was one thing that just made me crazy. So they asked my interpreter to do this experiment for her. They thought that my interpreter could be able to do the experiment for me. That was just like a shocking moment. And then they looked at my interpreter as my helper to do my everyday tasks. So that was shocking. And I really had to take that in and explain that no, my interpreter is just here to translate the words from English to ASL, ASL to English. I do everything else myself. They do not do any of my lab work. And the coordinator just still didn't seem to understand that. So.
And that I would be fuming just like you. And it's tough because it's tough to always, to do our work at the same time. We're having to do extra work just to educate other people, on what I can do. And sometimes it feels like we're hitting a brick wall, if they're not willing to, be open-minded or, be awake at what, reality is. So yeah, I resonate with you for sure. Anyway, so talking about, like bad experiences, but do you have a positive experience in the workplace, in the STEM field specifically, working primarily with hearing people? Any stories related to positive experiences?
Yeah, really, there's only a few people that I don't have great experiences with, but I have many experiences of people that I've wonderfully enjoyed working with. So my boss, my supervisor, knows some sign. So if the interpreter is not there, I can just chat with him. And it's awesome. And he's an awesome ally. When I'm going to conferences, they tell me I shouldn't bring my own interpreter. And it's because, well, it's my boss in a higher position. So he uses that opportunity and leverage to contact the higher ups at the leadership at the NIH to tell them, please fix this problem. And they will send emails, they'll CC me in. It's like I can take some of that responsibility off. It's like we both have I advocate for myself and I have help with me. And that's wonderful, wonderful to work with him. And everyone else in the lab, again, is great. I've never once seen anyone doubt my abilities in the lab as a deaf scientist. It's never happened. I've never had any problem with them, which is why I've stayed in that lab for so long.
That's great. So you mentioned, that your PhD, you will finish that soon, or you're working on it. The plan after your PhD, what is it? To stay at the lab, or do you have some other plan?
I have about 2 years left. So soon, I'm not sure, maybe soon, but so my lab work right now, I'm a little bit, I'm done with the lab work itself. I'm more focused on like science of communication, making information more accessible to everyone else, whether that's deaf people or, for example, there's a lot of information and topics related to cancer that many people tend to misunderstand because science has many complex vocabulary, even in English. So even that information needs to be accessible for everyone else, not just deaf people. Hearing people as well need a more, science needs to be a living room language. So I'm trying to become more involved in that. How I'm going to do that, I'm not exactly sure. Right now, I'm heavily involved with social media, Twitter, things like that. So I'm trying to get into TikTok, having the signed visual videos where I can make that information accessible. I'm not sure where that will lead me, but that's the plan.
I completely agree. I am not a science person. I'm not even a math person. But when people explain, those abstract concepts to me in a way that makes sense, then I'm like, oh my gosh, I know this. So
Yeah.
I'm happy that there's someone in the world working on it because it's very important work. I have two last questions before we transition to a Q&A portion of our program. Do you have any advice for our parents so they can support their children and get them, excited and immersed in the STEM field?
With STEM, I really encourage them to get involved in any opportunities related to STEM that they can find, whether that's a science fair, science courses that they can encourage their kids to take. Say, oh, science is interesting. It could be earth and space science, forensics, like I said, something fun. Go ahead and encourage your kids to get involved. Sometimes science can be intimidating, but give a different perspective. It can be fun, not just tough. People think math is always involved in science. That's not the case all the time. So you can find avenues to guide your kids through different interests and encourage them to be involved.
Do you have any advice for the interpreters that are interested in possibly interpreting in the STEM field? Because I'm just wondering if you have had any experience there.
Sure, yeah. My perspective 4 years ago compared to now is completely different. 4 years ago, I had an expectation set that my interpreters must already know science to be a good science interpreter. But now I realize that there's not many scientific interpreters. So for them to become a scientific interpreter, they have to have the right attitude to train, research, do their own prep on their own to learn about the field, have a mindset that would make them a great scientific interpreter. Their willingness to be open-minded and learn, that's the most important quality for this field.
Wonderful. Thank you. Oh, okay. Well, really, I actually have a third and final question I want to ask. Looking at, your future in, I don't know, 10 or 20 years ago, looking back at your past, what advice would you have given yourself as a deaf middle schooler? And that, of course, that advice could apply to some of our audience members as well. But that advice, what would you give to yourself?
Looking back, how to explain it? I wish there are many high school science internship opportunities, many that I didn't know about until I got to college. And I wish that, looking back, that I could do that. But again, it was middle school. So I don't know, that advice for parents, take that opportunity, look for ways for your middle school kids to get involved. But for myself, any opportunity that was given to you, take advantage of that opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, it's a wonderful way to transition to our Q&A to give everyone an opportunity. Yes. Okay. I'm going to open the floor up for Q&A, questions and answers. Again, I want to remind those of you that are new with us tonight, if you will let families ask their questions first. Once the families have had their opportunity to ask questions, we'll move to deaf professionals and community members. So do we have anyone of our families that would like to ask Megan a question? You're welcome to type in the chat. You're welcome to turn your mic on in voice. You're welcome to turn your camera on inside. But please allow me a moment to spotlight you if you turn your camera on for the interpreters and for the audience. I'll just wait a moment to get people, an opportunity to type their question in the chat. So while people are kind of digesting what they just learned, you mentioned your family and that they're here tonight, which is so great.
Yes.
How did your family empower you to advocate for yourself? Can you think of an example or possibly two?
Yeah. So firstly, they asked me if I wanted to go to public school, a hearing school. That really empowered me to make that decision on my own. They didn't force me to go to public school. But in the end, I said that I wanted to, and that was big. I was in 7th grade and they let me make that decision myself. That was a big thing for me. Another example with interpreters, they both really made sure I had good interpreters. Every year, right, I had the same interpreter for the rest of my primary career, but it wasn't guaranteed. So the contract would renew every year and I wouldn't know if I would get the same one, but my parents would ensure that I had the same one for my access. So that was big too.
Wonderful. So if the families are still in deep thought, I think we have a question. Is it Micah? The interpreter missed it. Monica. Amanda. Thank you. The interpreter's having an off night. Could you describe the deaf gain and how maybe you experienced it during your e-pericle?
I'm not sure if that's
is e-pericles, is that a typo by chance, Amanda? Okay. I was wondering what that word was. Oh, okay, okay. Okay, got it, fine. Let's sign it again. Would you describe deaf gain and how you may have had this during your experience as a breast cancer researcher?
Now when I really realize it, I don't really think I know what deaf gain means. Can you explain
Yeah,
it?
I hear you. Sure, that's not a problem. Yeah, this is a good tip, for our audience. Sometimes deaf people don't always know everything that everyone else knows. We are always learning. So deaf gain, basically, it's here. Let me give you just a real quick example. Things that deaf people or people that can sign that they can do that hearing people cannot do. So for example, I can talk to someone through sign language,
Okay.
or talk to someone through a window, and that kind of thing. A deaf, the deaf part of me has something that a hearing person cannot do. So yeah, maybe you can think about that and get the answer to that question.
Yes. So with my experience working at the lab, there's a lot of PPE, which means lab coats, gloves, masks, goggles, protective equipment. So sometimes hearing people, if you're in a specialized room, you can't really talk to each other, but I can sign. So that's cool. That's the gain. um, Other than that, I'm not really like I don't really pay attention to what I can do and what hearing people can't in my experience.
One thing that just came to mind is it easier for you to focus because you have less distractions?
Yes, definitely. Um, okay, well, so many hearing scientists can do long experiments and have music in headphones, and deaf people can do that as well. Some deaf people can hear fine, but for me, I can't hear anything, period. So I can't listen to music, and then I don't have that benefit. But I can do experiments, and I kind of have to live with my thoughts. There's nothing to distract me in that way. So I don't know if that's a gain. Maybe not. But yeah, sometimes people are talking, and I don't have to listen to that, and I can focus on what I'm on working. So there's that too.
I see a comment from Sandy says another example of deaf gain is sleeping through the cat meowing for food at 4 a.m. And my cat is trained to know that I will, she's got to tap me on the face with her paw because she realizes I'm deaf. Anyway. Okay, so I'll go ahead and open the floor to deaf professionals and community members. Do you have any questions? And if so, bring it on. I see one. Let me go ahead and spotlight you, Sandra. Hold on. Okay, go ahead, Sandra. So I don't know if it's really a question, but it's just something I've been brewing on during the presentation. I'm wondering if a certified interpreter needs to go up the ranks of technology in that field. And I'm wondering if it's like is that a new level of certification, possibly, a specialty certificate in advanced sciences?
That's a good question. I thought I believe Gallaudet is working on something like that to provide some kind of training for interpreters to learn how to interpret in science, not medical field, because we do have many interpreters in the medical field, in hospitals, for doctors. There's many of those. But science is a completely separate thing. So they're starting to work on that, I believe, now. More related to which signs to use for what terms, because again, science terms are coming out, they're still new. So there's more about that now. There's no solidified thing yet. So we'll see what happens about that.
So my second question then, you see many interpreters using classifiers to describe concepts better than using a particular sign. An example is a Coptic wire and how it goes down and it lights up a bulb, and then, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I'm happy you mentioned that, because for my field right now, I always ask my interpreters to sign in English word order, because they don't fully understand science again. So maybe their interpretation is not accurate if they're not interpreting directly the English. So I don't want to internalize something that's not exact for science. Right. So because there's been a few situations where interpreters assume that this is what something means, and then they interpret something that's not what the original speaker meant. So I do ask them to sign a little bit more English word order. That's another way for me to learn how to write science in English as well. So science is there's so many terms. Like I said, I need to know which words to use in what context, and language for science is different. So it feels like that's
a different
like another language to learn.
Great. Before we started the meeting, Megan, you mentioned a cool sign that your lab came up with. That I mean, it's not a classifier per se, but it was invented by the scientific team that you work with. And can you show us what that is?
Right. Yeah. So I study breast cancer, and the term metastasis comes up. And metastasis means that the cancer cells have spread from their original site to another part of the body. So we came up with this sign, something kind of like mess up and spread. So something got lost, and then now it started to spread. So my interpreter knows that sign, so we use that. We've been using that.
And I think that's really cool, actually. It's a great concept as well. I do see a comment. Megan. Oops, hold on. Now we've got several comments. Megan, can you share your experience with the word DYE, die, when the interpreter misunderstood?
Yes. So in my field, when I signed this sign, die, DYE, I meant stain. It's part of a specific process for one experiment. So this sign was stain, but my interpreter accidentally said die, which is a completely different concept. So that was another example of why scientific interpreters are incredibly important, and we encourage them to do right. They misunderstand some vocabulary, and
I think it's also a good point for our audience to take away from tonight. Even though I am not a scientist, I always have to take the time before an event or before I present, before I do something, to check with the interpreter to say, hey, here are the terms that may come up to be familiar with, or, you know, concepts, and provide that information in advance via notes or some sort of samples of my signing work. It depends on what the content is, but my point is, if I know that the content is very specific, or is very specific to my work and is not something widely known, then I have to do something in advance to work with the interpreter as a collaborative effort.
Right.
Because sometimes some deaf people look at the interpreter as a machine. Like, just, you know, the interpreter is a human being.
Right. Yeah.
They need a drink of water. They need to be able to breathe. They need to be able to, you know, take a break. That's why we always have 2 interpreters for these sessions, so that they have time to swap back and forth. It's the little things like that that are important to keep in mind when we do our work.
Definitely.
And it doesn't matter what field. Right. Yes, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. It's a perfect example. So that's why I want to make sure our audience is aware of that.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Okay, so back to Megan. Kathleen asked a question. When you were in middle school and high school, did you participate in your IEP meetings? And how did you advocate for your accommodations and your needs?
Yes, but I didn't really participate until much later, maybe during high school. I finally started to attend my meetings. But looking back, I don't really remember how I advocated for myself, honestly. I believe my parents did all of the advocating. I just kind of sat and watched and learned. Um, but I I remember saying that I wanted a few classes there at the public school, and I did mention what I wanted. I do remember that.
Wonderful. The next question is from Kendra. As a student in STEM right now, I know that it is not necessarily a female dominated field. You mentioned some hardships that you had as a deaf person in STEM. Do you think that being a female also contributed to any hardships you had in addition to being deaf?
Yeah, someone asked me that question recently, and I realized that I didn't really pay attention to what it was like being a woman in science. I was too focused on my deaf identity. Um, there was a lot of attention and worry about accessibility, language, interpreters. So I don't think I had time to focus on my identity as a woman in science enough. But that is something that I need to really think about.
It's interesting how intersectionality is in different identities, how that all balances out. Because different identities have more weight on the context at times.
Yes. And sometimes, like, maybe men in science they'll explain a concept to me that I already know, and they'll act as if I don't know. But I can't really tell if it's because I'm a woman or because I'm deaf. So yeah, in those types of moments, I can't tell.
But I'm wondering, Megan, when you were a student at Gallaudet, I mean, almost all the students there are deaf. So did you have more focus on your female identity at Gallaudet compared to your deafness?
Yes, yeah, so it's interesting though, at Gallaudet, they have a really good mix of genders, a really good mix from what I can remember. So it never really felt like there was a power imbalance there. I felt like everything was great there.
Okay, well, it's good to know. Okay, here's another question. This one is from Savannah. While working in that heavily specialized terminology that science uses, do you find it more difficult to explain scientific concepts to people who don't study science? Or does it seem more difficult for your colleagues to understand that everyone does not understand science terminology? Or are they both separately difficult?
Yeah.
I hope I signed that question well.
So me and my colleagues, is that
I think I'm having a hard time understanding the question a little bit myself. Okay, so which is more difficult? Explaining science concepts to people who don't understand science, or explaining to your colleagues that they don't understand what you're saying?
I think scientists that I'm working with or have been working with are pretty good at being aware that science is not accessible for everyone. They're already aware of that. For me, I think it's really hard to explain science to a general audience. It's really tough. Honestly, it's ironic. It's easier for me to explain science in ASL than English. And then it's interesting when I'm maybe writing about science in general language, I have to sign it to myself first and then write it down. Yeah, so it's just easier for me to sign it and explain it in ASL than English.
And I have the same experience as you. Yeah.
Yeah, in general, it's really difficult to translate from science to general audience. It takes practice.
I had a math teacher eons ago. He didn't like math. And then finally, when I understood math, started to understand, he started to understand math, he started to teach. But he would always say that it's best to learn math from someone who hates math because they understand what we're going through, compared to someone who loves math and they think it's easy peasy and they have a hard time explaining in layman's terms because they feel like, you should already know this. I know it, right? So,
That's true.
that can apply to science as well. And if I get science and it's a piece of cake, how am I going to come down to a level of layman's terms for people? Right. So it is definitely a skill set to be able to do that.
Yes. And that's a good question that was asked.
Okay. So we've got about 9 minutes left. Are there any comments, any questions? Anybody have something that's pressing that you'd like to have an answer to? Okay, go ahead. I have 2 questions. This is Sharon. I worked as a specialist in the past, and I've seen many different things. It's a good idea for high school students to do a job shadow so that they can see different fields of work. And it makes it just a little bit easier for them to decide what they would like to major in or do after graduation. Deaf people are more visual, and they seem to notice more. As a lab researcher, do you notice? And can you share that information with your colleagues? Things that they may miss, and what have you noticed more than your lab colleagues do?
Yeah, so your first comment, shadowing, yes, absolutely. During high school, I did shadow a nurse, and I really enjoyed that experience. But I knew that I didn't want to be a nurse, but I still enjoyed the experience, and I really support that idea. And then for the second question, can you clarify about the visual nature and learning?
Yeah, so for example, let's say you notice something that maybe your hearing colleagues overlook.
Okay.
But because you're deaf, you're more visual and you notice it and you're like, hey, look at this. It's important to note this. Or maybe it wasn't.
Yes. So I think we as deaf people are more attentive to details. We recognize details faster. And there have been a few times where I receive some data and I show my supervisor and we're looking at it together and I tell him, I noticed this, look at this, looks a little bigger than other things. And he's like, oh, you're right. So it'll take him maybe just a few days to review that data and then recognize that. But I guess maybe that's a deaf gain.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, I see some additional comments. Carrie says, I totally agree with that. Excuse me, Sandra's comment, the interpreter is overlooked, says, like they say, you truly can understand something if you can explain it to someone else. Now Carrie's comment, she agrees with that. Math is easier for me, and I had to learn how to learn math in order to help my boys. Any final questions? Because we do have time for possibly one more or a comment or thought. I have two people. I'm going to go and take our family first before our deaf professional. All right, go ahead.
Hey, this is Toby.
Hey,
I
Toby.
was just asking about, and I'm sorry, everybody's still awake here. I just wanted to ask you, could you share like some of your research that you're doing and like what all it entails for you? And also, I've enjoyed this entire presentation. You have really enlightened everything. It was really good to hear about your journey with interpreters and job as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm focusing on one like uncharacterized gene currently, and we suspect that it is a
What is that sign?
sorry a suppressor.
Yeah, tumor suppressor.
A tumor suppressor. Thank you. And I'm focusing on what that role is playing in metastasis. So breast cancer specifically.
Okay, so explain that to me like I'm 5, Megan.
Okay. So there are many genes involved in cancer and its development. There's many genes. So we're focusing on one tiny specific gene that we're suspecting. Okay, so if that gene has a role in suppressing and preventing cancer from developing. So some people have lower presenting, so they don't have enough presentation of that gene that would be more likely to develop into cancer. So we're trying to figure out why and how it happens. So if that leads to maybe new treatment targets that we can come up with. I hope that that's clear. Yeah,
It's perfect. Thank you. That was wonderful work that you're doing.
thank you.
Thanks, Toby, for that question. Brenda, go ahead. Okay. Can you see me? Okay, great. I have one question. I know that the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, NTID, has a program for seniors, possibly juniors, where they can go and learn. But does Gallaudet have a program like NTID or just at NTID?
Gallaudet recently established a few years ago, I think, a STEM week summer camp for high schoolers.
It is, yeah, it's high school
students. So Gallaudet recently just established that, and they have a really strong STEM program at Gallaudet as well. It's called STAMP, STAMP, Science, Technology, Accessibility, Math, and Public Health.
Oh,
it's a really strong
STAMP. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah,
like that sign. We could use that sign for STAMP. Gotcha. Well, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the answer. Yes, great.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we are out of time. Oh my gosh, it's sad. But thank you, Megan, for coming, for sharing about your life and experience and your knowledge and all the comments of people saying that this was the best presentation they've had. Thanks again for coming. Before we wrap up, I wanted to thank the interpreters for tonight. I would like to thank all the families that came, the deaf professionals, the community members. And Megan, do you have any final comments before we go ahead and say goodbye?
Yeah, I want to thank you all for coming, and I really appreciate that you came and wanted to learn about this. I really hope you did learn something from this and encourage your kids to be involved in STEM.
Okay. Feel free to open your cameras and say goodbye.